Hey RVCC Online, it is finally summer. That means it's time to grill, it's time to get outside, or if you're like me, it's time to stay inside and do some board games. And it's time to think about vacations, which on that note, I'm really curious, what is the best vacation you've ever taken? Go ahead and type your response in the chat box and we'll be back in just a moment and we'll come back with an ad from a galaxy far, far away.
Live your Star Wars story in an immersive two-night adventure only at Walt Disney World Resort.
The Star Wars Galactic Star Cruiser was an immersive hotel experience by Disney that was, well, littered with problems. The cheapest price for 2 nights was $6,000. Many of the activities on board did not function as intended. The rooms were cramped and windowless. The advertisements were misleading and ambiguous. And worst of all, they pitched it as a family experience. But even I, someone who has no kids, knows that any itinerary that starts at 7 a.m. in the morning and runs till 11 p.m. at night is a death sentence for most parents with little ones. One of the biggest mistakes Disney made was trying to continue something that everyone knew wasn't working. The price wasn't working, the experience was bad, their year they opened, 2022, inflation was up by 8%. It was clear that either Disney needed to adjust their approach or end the project altogether. Instead, they did what you're not supposed to do. They doubled down. Disney thought that because they dropped over $400 million and spent 3 years developing the project, eventually it would work itself out. Instead, 18 months after opening, Disney lost $350 million and had to shut down the hotel for good. Just like Disney's persistence in a failing project, we sometimes hold on to friendships that we don't realize are no longer working. Sometimes, despite our best intentions and significant investments of time and effort and maybe even money, a relationship simply won't work out as we hoped. Now, unlike the Galactic Star Cruiser, our friendships may have been a real blessing to us at one point. We may have found people who we related with, who we were encouraged by and shared similar goals with. But the thing about friendships is that some of them have their seasons. King Solomon once put it this way in the book of Ecclesiastes: "There's a time for everything and a season for every activity under the heavens. A time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot." Friendships, like everything else in life, change, and there's many reasons why. Not all of them are bad. For example, marriage, kids, and what happens in our families shifts our priorities. Work can get busy and change our schedules. Moving might force us to be in long-distance relationships. Different opinions and goals can cause conflict, and what we experience might change us, or what they experience might change them. And when change happens, sometimes issues arise, and the worst thing we can do when this happens in a friendship is resume with business as usual. We can be tempted to ignore the problems, to double down and just hope that things will improve. However, there are times when we need to recognize when a friendship just isn't working out, and either we need to have a difficult conversation and adjust the relationship, or our friendships are going to hurt us and keep us from the life God calls us to. And here's the thing, even the closest friendships must navigate change, like the friendship between Paul and Barnabas. If you don't know who these two are, Paul and Barnabas were pivotal leaders in the early church, renowned for their missionary work. Their friendship was strong and productive, but even they faced a moment where they had to go their separate ways. And you would never expect this if you knew about Barnabas and Paul, because these two were the Shaq and Kobe of the early church, a dynamic duo that had their own three-peat. Number one, they successfully led a multi-ethnic church plant in Antioch. Championship number two, they convinced the Jerusalem Council to overturn 2,000 plus years of policy by including Gentiles in the church without the need for them becoming Jewish. And championship number three, they started at least 3 new churches in Galatia in less than 1 year. And so at this point, it seemed like nothing could stop Paul and Barnabas. They added Carl Malone, they added Gary Payton. They were ready to do even greater things. But then things changed. And we can read about that moment of change in Acts chapter 15. And we're going to go ahead and throw it up on the screen for you right here. Sometime later, Paul said to Barnabas, "Let us go back and visit the believers in all the towns where we preach the word of the Lord and see how they are doing." Barnabas wanted to take John, also called Mark, with them, but Paul did not think it was wise to take him because he had deserted them in Pamphylia and had not continued with them in the work. They had such a sharp disagreement that they parted company. Barnabas took Mark and sailed for Cyprus, but Paul chose Silas and left, and commended by the believers to the grace of the Lord. He went through Syria and Cilicia and strengthening the churches there. So at the center of this disagreement was what to do with John Mark. You see, Paul wanted to leave him off of the roster because Mark already proved to be unreliable. When the going got tough, Mark ditched Paul and Barnabas, and Paul didn't want to take any risks this time around. But meanwhile, Barnabas wanted to give Mark a second chance and convince Paul to do the same. After all, it was Barnabas who gave Paul a second chance when no one else was willing to look his way. So if Barnabas is saying Mark deserves another goal, who in the heck is Paul to say no? But guess what? Paul says no, and they get into it, and they get into this heated debate, and I honestly think this is one of the healthiest examples of friendship in the entire Bible. And no, you did not mishear me, except how I pronounce Bible, and here's why I think it's the healthiest friendship. Often when there is conflict, we become avoidant, especially when we are at odds with a friend. And the easy thing to do is just not to say anything, because honestly, sometimes it's too risky to be honest with the people we love, because we think to ourselves, what if they disagree? What if they get upset? What if it changes everything? There are just too many what ifs that keep us from being vulnerable and real. And that's why Paul and Barnabas are good friends, not because they never argued, but because they loved each other enough to name what wasn't working and to have an uncomfortable conversation about it. Paul could have said okay to Mark, but then just resent Barnabas for the next year. And Barnabas could have said okay to Paul and then vent about it to Silas later on Instagram. But instead, they talked it out in person together as good friends. Now, you might be thinking, if you've read the rest of the story, hold up, how are they the best example? Didn't their friendship fail when they decided to split up? And for the longest time, that's what I thought as well. And I've been on Team Barnabas and thought that Paul was a horrible friend for not compromising. But then as I was writing this sermon, I changed my mind. And here's why. Paul and Barnabas had 2 very different callings at this point in their lives. And for Paul to be faithful to God, he needed to press forward. He needed teammates who were dependable and ready to go. And he knew that his mission was to reach more people and plant more churches, and that he neither had the gifts nor the time nor the patience to invest in Mark. But for Barnabas to be faithful to God, he needed to slow down. He needed to live into his calling as a mentor. And the most important thing he was tasked with, that only he could do, that he was gifted for, was building Mark back up. You see, we misunderstand this story if we are trying to figure out who was right and who was wrong, because both were right. Both had important work to do, and they realized that in this new season of life, they couldn't do the work together. And just take a moment to imagine how painful of a decision this was. Back then, there was no FaceTime. There was no UPS. Barnabas was heading off to an island 65 miles west. Paul was north to a group of people that tried to murder him the last time around he was there. So when they are saying goodbye here in Acts 15, they are pretty much closing the door on the last 8 years of their friendship. But they did it anyway. Because even though Paul and Barnabas were great friends, they knew that if their friendship got in the way of what God wanted them to do, it was time to go their separate ways. And history shows that they made the right choice, because Paul did not take Mark. He was able to add Timothy to his team, who would become an important leader in the church in Ephesus. And meanwhile, because Barnabas did not give up on Mark, the man initially known for abandoning the work of spreading the gospel ended up writing the first gospel. And neither outcome would have been possible if Paul and Barnabas doubled down on their friendship instead of being honest about their friendship. What we can learn from Paul and Barnabas is that healthy friendships opt for honesty and navigate change with grace. Let me just say a little bit more about this. First of all, healthy friendships, when we want to have them, we need to be honest about what's not working. Paul and Barnabas shows us that friendship involves honest dialogue, even when it's uncomfortable. And if we want better friendships, we need to be okay with taking these risks as well. When we disagree, we need to talk it out. When we get hurt, we need to name the hurt. If we feel like we aren't on the same page, we need to make space for that in conversation. And yes, there are no guarantees that there will be understanding and that you will come to a compromise or that your friendship will be stronger on the other side of that conversation. In fact, you may discover, like Paul and Barnabas, that what is best is to go your separate ways. And we fear that. We don't want that, and so we choose not to address the issue at all. But here's the alternative. You stay quiet, you get bitter, you feel anxious, and eventually the friendship robs both of you of the joy God intends and makes you less like Jesus. So lead with honesty. And the second thing they teach us is this: navigate change with grace. Paul and Barnabas' story is not a license to mistreat friends in our lives we disagree with, or to cut off people who are inconvenient or who annoy us. People grow, priorities shift, paths diverge, but that doesn't mean that the solution is to always end friendships when things get tough. Rather, Jesus invites us to navigate change with grace. And sometimes that means continuing to invest in friendships even if they have to look different. For example, I used to be able to hang out with one of my friends every day during seminary, but now we are both married and living on opposite sides of the U.S., and one of us is working on their doctorate in the Old Testament, and the other one is trying to preach the Old Testament without making his friend cringe. A lot of change has happened over the last few years, and so this means that we talk to each other maybe once a quarter, maybe once every 2 quarters, but even with the lack of frequency, we still take time to pray for each other. We still make it a priority to catch up with each other, and I'm confident that if I needed to reach out to someone or if he needed to reach out to someone, we would each be each other's first person to reach out to. Now, there are friends I see way more often than him, but not as many that I can be as honest with than him. And because this friend constantly encourages and challenges me to love God, follow Jesus, and read and study the the Old Testament a lot better, this is a friendship I need to hold on to. even when change means we need to adjust the friendship just a little bit. And then there are times when the most loving thing we can do as a friend is step back from the relationship. This doesn't mean we prematurely end friendships because of unresolved hurt, disagreements we haven't talked out, or just because it's convenient. We don't get to opt out of difficult work of loving our friends, but after saying everything that needs to be said and doing what needs to be done, sometimes it just becomes evident that this thing between us is no longer good for us. And when your friend is no longer good for you, or you are no longer good for them, or you enjoy being together, but God has you going different ways, the most loving thing you can do as a friend in that time is to make space from you in order to make space for what God wants to do in their life and in your life. Making the decision to go separate ways will be difficult, but it doesn't mean God isn't at work. Paul and Barnabas likely grieved their split for the rest of their lives, yet knowing what they know now, they probably wouldn't change their decision. The churches that Paul and Timothy planted flourished and transformed thousands of lives, while Barnabas' mentorship of Mark developed an essential leader for the early church. Mark's transformation was in fact so significant that Paul later sought his help. So here's the thing, friendships changing or ending can be challenging, and we see that in the story and we know that in our lives, and we may not immediately see the benefit of why our friendships have to change or end, but if God can take a cross and a tomb and produce love and hope out of these things, perhaps He can take what we see as an end and a tragedy and make it the beginning of greater things. Some friendships will change. Some friendships might end. But instead of facing that reality with anxiety, friends, we can rest in the truth that God stays the same and is working all things, even the end of our friendships, for our good. So here's the thing. Here's what I want you to do, how to apply this to your life. If there are relationships in your life that feel misaligned, I want to encourage you to address it. And here's some ways that you can go about it. First of all, I want to invite you to pray. I want you to ask God to show you where a friendship might need an adjustment or a change. And then the second thing I want to encourage you to do is to reach out to that friend and initiate an honest conversation with them. And don't do this over email or text, by the way. And if at all possible, find a good time and place where you can be together in person. You are not rushed, and both of you are comfortable and at ease to have this important dialogue. The third thing I would encourage you to do is to name and adjust. Clearly express what each of your needs from the relationships are and make adjustments accordingly. And here's also another helpful tip I've learned from our lead pastor, Rusty Carlson. When naming grievances, always start with, I feel this way, and never say, you are this way. It makes the conversation go significantly better. And last of all, when you go into these conversations, the final piece of advice we have for you is to do it with hope. Remember, no matter the outcome, God is at work. Friendships that change or end are never failures, but opportunities for God to do later what is unimaginable for us today. So enter into those conversations with hope and know that no matter the decision, no matter the adjustment, God can work that for good.